and don't really love the Lord and don't really display the fruit of the Spirit in their lives. And so it is a very important part of Christian growth, discipleship, spiritual formation, to understand the biblical narrative, the biblical story. I know I'm preaching to the choir. You guys already believe this, but I guess just by way of reminding you of the importance of situating everything that we know biblically speaking within the overarching framework of God's beautiful story that takes us to Jesus and on to the new heaven and earth. And we look forward to that, figuring out where we fit in. And it's more than just a kind of a religion of do's and don'ts and this is what's right and this is what's wrong, but rather finding yourself being invited to participate with God in the most beautiful thing ever, and that is joining hands with Him in His work in the kingdom, you know. And you don't get that by starting in Matthew. You get it by starting in Genesis. And you get it by spending time doing some stuff like hopefully what we'll do in this class, you know, kind of keying in on it, but not forgetting what comes before or what comes after it and seeing how it all works. And so, biblically speaking, studying biographies is a good way to do that, because you can remember stories. Everybody remembers stories. You don't remember facts. Most of us don't remember facts without constant repetition. You got to keep coming back to them again and again and again. But everybody remembers stories. You know, everybody remembers, if you've been exposed to the story of Genesis 22 of Abraham offering Isaac on Mount Moriah, you know, mountains of Moriah, you remember that story. You remember Sodom and Gomorrah and fire and brimstone. You remember stories like that. You remember, you know, the flood. You remember David and Bathsheba, the good and the bad stories. I mean, we remember they kind of stick with us. But fitting those within a bigger story. So we got, you know, many narratives within the meta narrative. We've got these mini stories within the grand story. And so I'll probably do some repetition on that just to make sure we're reminded of where it all kind of fits together. I don't know if Jerry's here tonight. I know Jerry Culberson still teaches, I think, at Faulkner. I taught there. They have a Birmingham campus, and I taught there for a while. And Thursday nights, and they had this class that they had, most of us Bible teachers, adjunct instructors teaching, called, what was it called? They changed the name of it, but anyway, something like, might have been called Scheme of Redemption, something like that. And they changed the name of it, but the content stayed the same. And I went through, in the opportunity I had with the students, to help them to understand what I want to share with you now. And I'll put it on the screen behind me. It won't be new to everybody here, but it might be new to some of you. It's 12 steps, 12 kind of things, and this is facts. But these are kind of like pegs that I hope you can kind of fit together. And when you read a story, David and Bathsheba, David and Goliath, Isaac, Jacob, Esau, Esther, you got Daniel and Ezekiel, and you got Paul and Peter and Mary and others. Like, where do you hang them? Where do they go? Where do they go on this? So this is, I do this to lead us to Abraham so we know where this fits, all right? Again, maybe repetitive for some of you, maybe not so much for everybody. Okay, look at when you start the story, you start the Bible. Everybody can remember, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, right? It was good, 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 it was very good, Key word of Genesis 1 and 2 is good. God made a creation, beautiful, it was well ordered, it was exactly what God wanted it to be, and that's the theme of Genesis 1 and 2. And if you can kind of remember, it helps to remember how one flows into the next. And the first few are kind of easy, You got the creation, Genesis 1 and 2, which flows pretty naturally into Genesis 3, because everybody remembers, I think, what happens immediately after. Genesis 1 and 2 sets the stage for Genesis 3, which is the fall. Adam and Eve did what they did, ate the forbidden fruit of the forbidden tree. But really that whole section, I've got Genesis 3 through 10 here that kind of fit together, because that's one whole image of what fallenness looks like. You got the fruit of Genesis 3. You've got Cain murdering Abel in Genesis 4, and they're cast out. Well, in Genesis 3, they're exiled, and then Cain kills Abel, and you got wandering, and you got violence, and you've got chaos, and then you've got it kind of spreading out and permeating the earth. And so God brings the flood, Genesis 6, 7, 8, 9. Everything kind of starts over, but it doesn't get any better after the flood. Noah gets drunk. His nakedness is exposed. That's in Genesis, is that Genesis 9, I guess, or 10? That's 9. And that leads to, you know, the nations of the earth start growing again. The families of the earth start growing again. So Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and you got the genealogy there. And then you may remember from that, we're kind of, I think, expected to see this, that you got the Tower of Babel. Things aren't any better. People are still trying to build their own idols. They're still trying to be their own gods. So you got the Tower of Babel in Genesis 10, 11. Is it the Tower of Babel in 11? It's the first part of 11, isn't it? So all that paints this picture of fallenness, you know? And then you turn the page, and it says that God called Abram, makes him some promises. It starts this pattern. It's like God is helping us. He's helping get the story back on track. And you got Abraham's son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons who became the 12 patriarchs, you know, the 12 heads of 12 tribes. So that's the rest of the book of Genesis, from Genesis 12 all the way to the end. You know, we key in kind of on Jacob's famous son Joseph, but it's about this family, which then leads you to, if you remember how the story progresses, you know, they end up at the end of Genesis 50. They're in Egypt, and then Exodus, which is a long time later, 400 years later, they're still there, and now they're slaves. And then you pick up the story there with another main character whose name is Moses. God raises him up to lead them out of captivity. And that's the books of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. So you've got the giving of the law, you've got the wandering in the wilderness, you've got all that stuff that happens during that. Finally, at the end of that time, they get right on the cusp of going into the land that God had promised Abraham. Leave where you are and go to a land that I will show you, is what he told Abraham. And I'm going to give you this land. A long time later, it still hasn't become the possession of his descendants. But at the end of Deuteronomy, they're right on the cusp of going in. And Moses dies, and that leads you into the book of Joshua, which is a conquest. So, you know, you got this creation, fall, patriarchs, Exodus, now conquest. They're conquering the land that God had. See, what God is doing is he's fulfilling all these promises that he made. We're going to study these tonight a little bit. These promises that he made to Abraham. It takes a long time. God doesn't get in a hurry about stuff. It's one of the important lessons about learning about, you know, studying Abraham's life and others is we're obedient to God, but God doesn't fulfill all of his promises by next Friday at noon. So you get to the book of Joshua, and you've got conquest. Joshua goes in, you know, Jericho, Ai, and the chaos there, and the mess up there. But they go through the land. There's conquest. They don't go about it the way God wanted them to, so it creates all sorts of problems. But they set up a kind of a quasi form of government. It's not really a form of government. It's really just kind of unstructured. And that leads us into the book of Judges. You know, you just got a series of these, mostly men, but also Deborah, who rule for periods of time, and things get better, and then that person dies, and they descend into chaos again, which causes the people to cry out. So that's the book of Judges. Also, Ruth falls under there. So Judges, next book after Judges is Ruth, that tells you the story of Ruth and Boaz and that whole thing. That took place during the period of Judges. Well, they're not happy with having judges, right? It's not good. So what do they want? Yeah, we want a king. Yeah, just like all the other nations, which leads you into 1 Samuel. And a lot of stuff in there, of course, but 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, a lot of overlap there. 1st, 2nd Samuel and 1st, 2nd Kings overlap greatly with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And you got united kingdom for a while, Saul, David, Solomon. You got a divided kingdom with Rehoboam and the south and Jeroboam in the north and all that stuff happening. But are things good or bad during that time? Kind of obedience-wise, for the most part. Not too good. Lots of disobedience, lots of idolatry, lots of rebellion, lots of disobedience. And God kept coming to them, sending them prophets over and over again, Isaiah and Jeremiah and others, and telling them, if you guys don't straighten up, God's going to take you into where? Yeah, Babylon. We typically call that the exile, you know. And they didn't straighten up, and so they went into exile and were there 70 years. But then God had promised them, after you've been there 70 years, I'm going to bring you back. That's called the return. You know, Ezra and Nehemiah tell us about the return. And then you've got Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, and then that's it. So you got a 400-year period of silence, you know, and nothing, no word from God during that time. And then the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare you the way of the Lord, make his path straight. You've got the preparation for Jesus, and Jesus lives and teaches and serves and ministers and dies and is resurrected, leading us at the end of his life, right before he went back up into heaven, go into all the world, spread the gospel, which ushers us into this time of missions in which you and I now live, anticipating that day when, and really in fact, I think I actually had another one on here when I taught this at school, but because you don't need to forget about the next one. 12, I like the number 12, but missions leads us into this time when God makes all things right. You know, we're looking forward to that day. The kingdom will be realized in all of it. The kingdom is here. Jesus reigns, but we haven't realized it in all of its fullness. And so the fullness of the kingdom hasn't come and won't come until the Lord comes and makes all things right, you know. So having a framework where you can get comfortable thinking about that and fitting whatever you're studying in Scripture into that will change the way you read the Bible. It'll change the way you think about what God is doing, you know. And so I won't come back to that. I may come back to it briefly some as I teach this. This isn't a class on the whole Bible, but just because I want you to remember when we get done with this class, I want you to remember the significance of Abraham. But Abraham's significance can only be realized when you understand what came before Abraham and where everything ends up. Like if you just remember some stories about Abraham, if you don't have a good understanding of that, then Abraham won't make any sense to you. Why did Abraham come? What's the purpose of Abraham? Why is God calling him? I mean, it's got some neat stories in it, but what's the significance of it? And the significance is God made a perfect world. Everything is as it ought to be. We made a mess of it, Adam and Eve. Violence, murder, mayhem, chaos, flood, death, idolatry, a tower. Nothing's getting better. It's like God restarted with Noah. Nothing got better. We're still here. You and I are still here. Can't fix our own mess. And so Genesis 12 is that moment where this pivotal moment in the biblical narrative where God steps in and starts where we can see it. God already knew, of course, but where we can see it in a very historical kind of way, God steps in and says, okay, I'm starting something here that's going to change everything. And he calls Abraham. Through no goodness of Abraham's own. This story isn't really about Abraham so much as it is about what God does through Abraham. Abraham wasn't picked because he was better or smarter or more spiritual or whatever. Abraham wasn't. We have every reason to believe that Abraham was a polytheist. He was an idol worshiper, living according to the pagan standards of his day. He lived in Ur of the Chaldees, which was the center, one of the two centers of worship of the moon god, Sin. And the other center of the worship of this god was Haran, which we'll talk about that in a minute. May very well be why Abraham and his father and his family stopped in Haran and kind of settled there for a while instead of doing exactly what God told him to do. But Abraham was just like everybody else. He was a polytheist, lived according to the pagan standards of his day, and yet God picked him. And he said, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." That promise, I mean, this statement to Abraham, it's quoted, it's mentioned again multiple times in Genesis. It's mentioned multiple times in the New Testament. This is a foundational thing. I mean, this is a very important part of understanding the biblical story is reading this with understanding what God is doing here. So a couple of things before we get to the content of the promise. Ur of the Chaldees, you may have heard it said before, about Ur we've got more, as far as the ancient world is concerned, we've got more archaeological evidence and more, there's just so much that's been recovered in Babylon, or what became Babylon, what is now, the Persian Gulf area there, Iraq, and so on. So much has been uncovered there to help us to get a pretty good understanding of what the ancient world was like there, at least some of the advances they had made. Very advanced culture for the ancient world. A lot of wealth there. They had made some advances as far as the flow of water and some like plumbing and some things that were kind of unheard of in other parts of the world. Ur of the Chaldees was a pretty important place. You guys probably know where it is already, but just for a second, it helps me in my mind if I can visualize some geography. And so you've got down on the southeast portion of that map there, Ur of the Chaldees. There's an alternate location. I don't know how well you can see that. Maybe not very well. But down the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see the white box there, Ur of the Chaldees. And then you'll see another one at the top of the screen that says Ur, possible location. Most scholars believe that it's the southern, the southeastern one there, down. I wish this map was a little bit bigger so you could see the Persian Gulf. You can see the rivers flowing south, and they flow into the Persian Gulf there, and so modern-day Iraq and, Kuwait and Iran's over there to the east, and, Saudi Arabia to the south, and so on. So that's this part of the world. That's where Ur probably was, advanced part of the world. That's where Abraham lived with his father, his brothers, their kids, and their clan, and as people, he ultimately became a nomad, but that's where they were. So part of the world we're talking about. You'll notice at the top, sort of to the left, you see Haran there, Haran. That's the other center of worship of the Sin, the god Sin, S-I-N, a moon god. And it's interesting that they stopped there. But anyway, maybe we'll talk more about that later. A couple of possible routes there. You guys have heard of the Fertile Crescent, which it's kind of, most likely Abraham traveled along the Fertile Crescent. It's called a crescent because from your perspective, it goes from Ur, kind of goes up north, and then it curves back to the south. It has to do with irrigation, water, and so on, the fertility of the soil. Fertile Crescent. So that's the pattern that Abraham most likely traveled. He went up to Haran, stopped and settled there, stayed for a while, and then ultimately he went down southwest to the south and a little bit to the west, and he entered what is the Promised Land. This is in the news, of course, right now because of what's going on in Israel and Gaza and so on. Right now, it's been a source of news for years. It's been unsettled for generations. And that's where God ultimately is going to take Abraham and where Jerusalem would ultimately be, where Jesus would ultimately die and so on. Okay. So the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house. Now look in your Bible to Genesis 11. Go back just a little bit from Genesis 12, a few verses up. Verse 27, these are the generations of Terah. That's Abraham's father. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So 3 brothers. Haran fathered Lot. Haran died. So Lot's dad died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarah was barren, she had no child. Here's verse 31, begins their travels. They left Ur here. Verse 21, Terah, he's the patriarch, he's the head of the family. Abram had responsibilities to 2 people primarily. He had a culturally, had responsibility to his father as the patriarch, and he had a responsibility to lead his wife. All right, to submit to his father Terah and to lead his wife and any kids if they had them. Of course, they didn't at this point. Took Abram his son and Lot the son of Haran. So Lot's father has died, so he's kind of taken in with his uncle Abram. Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarah his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. And they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So what we have there, preceding what we read in chapter 12, is that they left Ur. They were going to Canaan, traveling the path of the Fertile Crescent, and when they got to Haran, they stopped. Who knows why they stopped? I read some that speculate they stopped because they weren't ready to leave their culture. They weren't ready to leave the worship of their God, of the primary God. And the 2 sinners were Ur and Haran, so that's a possibility. Abram is still submitting to his father, Terah, at this point. Some scholars, they assign some blame to Abram here. Honestly, I don't know. I could be persuaded in either way. Chronologically speaking, where did God give the command? Did God give it when they were in Haran to go to Canaan, or did he give it in Ur? Right? Because if you read the next verse, it says, now God said, right? The Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your father's house. So where did he say that to him? You got a footnote there. Stay with this. It's a little technical here, but I want you to at least wrestle with it so you see the difficulty, significance of it. The ESV footnote says, now the Lord had said to Abram. You see that? Or if you're reading from the NIV, I just think it's got it in the text itself. The Lord had said. Why does that matter? Well, if he said it in Genesis 12, like if this is chronological, then God didn't say it when he didn't say it in Ur because they're in Haran at this point, Because you see what I'm